Are a lot of companies using zero trust, or is it mainly a marketing?
I think zero trust was mostly a marketing buzzword until CISA started to put out some guidance defining what zero trust is. So now that we actually have measurable, actionable guidance, which kind of takes us all the way back to our business objectives discussion, right? Now we have something that we can measure against. I don't know if zero trust necessarily excites our board and our CIO, right? We probably have messaging to do outside of the security industry on that. But from a model that we can measure and get metrics from, we've got that first key piece that moves us away from marketing and buzzwords to something that's meaningful. And zero trust, another favorite term that was thrown out for a long time was APT. So now we've got a lot of threat intelligence and profiling of actors. But all of that really is just intelligence that's coming out of this infrastructure, right? And saying, okay, based on this infrastructure, now I can glean this data that can help me begin to identify how is someone moving through the network, what are their techniques, what might they be ready to, what might be their intents, right? Where we've kind of shifted to a level of threat intelligence where we're not just saying bad actor, we're trying to understand their intents so that we know what that core data is that we're trying to protect, which takes us back to some of that data center modeling where you're trying to figure out how to protect your crown jewels or your core IP assets and understand where they are and put them in some kind of enclaves or special protections. What we need to do is get out of some of the rigidity of the way we feel like we have to manually validate controls and some of that audit mindset and figure out how can we move the heavy lifting of control auditing to automation. And I think we sometimes feel like, well, if I put enough blood and sweat and tears into it, it's valuable. We really, where we want your blood, sweat, and tears as auditors, as compliance people, as security people, is not going to the ERP system and beating somebody up over adding one extra access to their user role. I need those people in the industry to focus that detail and that thinking to AIML models, to emerging technologies, to the spaces where we are trying to catch up versus trying to look for that big finding on your next audit right in the system that you've audited 700 times.
Hi everyone, welcome to Cyber Sierra's Safe Tech Talk series. Today we have with us an esteemed guest whose name is Chad Lorenc. Chad is a highly experienced cybersecurity professional with expertise in the fields of CISO, CSO, and VP of Information Security. With over 20 years of industry experience, he has made significant contributions to the field of cybersecurity, particularly in cloud security, security architecture, and compliance. Chad is currently working with Amazon Web Services, which we all know fondly as AWS, one of the leading cloud computing platforms, where he has played a crucial role in ensuring the security and compliance of the organization's systems and services. His extensive knowledge and skills in cybersecurity have helped bridge the gap between security and business operations, providing valuable insights and strategies to protect sensitive information in startups, financial services institutions, life sciences companies, and manufacturing industries. Education-wise, Chad holds a strong academic background. He has pursued his education at Colorado State University, where he gained a solid foundation in cybersecurity and information security. Chad's dedications and contributions to the cybersecurity field have earned him recognition and respect among his peers. His expertise in cloud security, security architecture, and compliance makes him a valuable asset in safeguarding organizations against evolving cyber threats. Chad, we're privileged to have you here on our show. Thank you for joining us. Are you ready for the first question?
I'm ready. Thank you for having me.
Awesome. So let's start with a bit broad. What industry trends are you most interested in or excited about these days?
That's a good question. I think one of the things that I'm most excited about or interested in is a little bit of the AIML, but it's more around the security lake offering that AWS is putting out there, and a lot of our partners are starting to work with as far as I think as an industry, we've talked a long time about an open cybersecurity schema, kind of that agreement on a framework on how we were going to do that and how we're going to share data and treat data and eventually, hopefully, build some intelligent analytics around data that can come from multiple sources and multiple partners is one of the things I'm really excited about, especially coming off some of the buzz from Reinforce.
Awesome. Let's dive a bit deeper into that. You mentioned open cybersecurity schema. For the rest of us who may not know, could you share?
Yeah, so the industry got together, and this is actually kind of cool because it's not AWS. I know a lot of people are worried about lock-in and wanting to have, hey, how do we make sure that no one security company is driving the security industry, right? Because we don't want security driven by sales. We want security driven by outcomes. And so this is an open cybersecurity schema framework that was developed in the security industry as a whole. I believe one of the core sponsors ended up actually being Tenable. I'd have to go validate that. But the idea is that everybody agrees to a framework that we're going to output security logs. So a great example is IP address, right? Some people call it source IP, some people call it IP, some people call it egress, some people, and you have all these different things. Well, something as simple as IP addressing gets really difficult to map across vendors. So any SIM you try to build in the world, one of the first things you do is a massive amount of data translation. And every time someone changes their format, it blows up your SIM and basically impacts your SOC and your security stance, right? So this really got away from everybody doing their own thing and started to allow an open information exchange. But even more importantly is when you start thinking about my endpoint vendor and my network firewall vendor and my cloud vendor and my IAM vendor can all put data, or my email security vendor is another great one, all put data in the same format, in the same repository. Suddenly you start to actually be able to have an intelligent conversation about AI and ML. And the context you could actually gain from bringing all those sources together might finally break down our pain point of building 100 security silos that all don't communicate, and where we have all these gaps as we try to do those handoffs and correlations. So really excited about that. Obviously, the power and the compute of that has to live somewhere where you can easily manage, store, and manipulate that data. So that's why I think AWS has taken some of the leadership in there, where some of our other vendors that produce more of those logs have driven some of the framework. And so just exciting to see the security industry begin to find better ways to work together in a way that will benefit the overall security model.
That's an excellent start to our conversation. There's a few directions I'd like to take it. The first one is just dive a little bit deeper, and then the second one would be how do we communicate the value of this to the board, which we'll come to shortly, right? So open cybersecurity schema allows standardization of data formats. So it's easier to ingest this data and work with this data. Am I broadly right?
Yeah, so it defines the data outputs from the tools, but obviously once all the tools are in the same output, then farming that data becomes a lot easier, putting AI ML intelligence around it, because now it's predictable. Because in us security people don't know it, but we've been building data lakes for a long time with our SOCs, right? Because you're doing data transformation, you're dumping it into a central repository, and you're trying to build correlations or logic off of that, right? So in some ways, I think security guys have more data experience than the average IT person on what an AI ML model might eventually look like. But I feel like as an industry, sometimes we get marketing put around that, but we've not ever been able to really leverage the full diversity of our ecosystem in a meaningful way. And so that's really what excites me.
Awesome. And is this standard or schema? Is this live? What is the status of it?
It is live. You can actually see it in GitHub. One of the most exciting things, though, is more than just being in GitHub and being defined. That framework is now being implemented. Security vendor after security vendor, as I went through the Reinforce arena, told me, hey, we're now outputting OCSF, and we've built this into our tool, or it's on our roadmap, or we'll have it before the end of this conference. And those kind of things excite me, because there's definitely kind of a data gravity to that, right? The more and more people that agree to it and start outputting to it, the more benefit, both for the people that design tools to then help us put intelligence around that, but also enrich that data in a meaningful way. Like I said, when you start getting those normally just jointed parts of security all in the same place.
Awesome. So Chad, as a techie, I can geek out with you on this all day, right? I think this is a very interesting development. Thank you for sharing about it on our show. Now, this actually starts to get into security messaging. And for technical folks, we can discuss this, we can figure out ways to benefit from it and improve our lives, become more productive, and so on. How do we take this and relate it? There's so many security messaging that goes on. How do we take this and package it in a way that business owners and boards can understand?
Right. So I mean, there's kind of the two perspectives, right? When things roll down the hill to you as a security person, say, hey, I read a cool article, we need to do AIML in security. This might give you a place to start. But really, that's not the ideal strategy, right? And I don't think that's what you're talking about. You're talking about, how do we propose up through our CIOs, our CEOs, and our board of directors? How do we format security in a way that it becomes meaningful? And that's something that I'm really passionate about. It's actually one of the drivers even of the business unit I work in, is how do we help security people better articulate security business objectives? So I've been doing a lot of work on that. Some of the keys of a security business objective is it has to be tied to the business, right? It has to have appeal at those stakeholder levels, but it also has to be measurable, right? And that's one of the things we struggle with in security, is how do you measure that? And part of the reason we struggle with that in security is we keep on trying to do an insurance adjuster's job, right? Where we're trying to justify driving down risk. And I've got some phenomenal, very cool risk models that I've designed. And you can do that, but that's a really hard exercise and a really hard sell of, hey, I drove down risk X amount according to my model. What you really want to do is flip that and align that to how you're enabling the business. And that's a tricky talk, right? Not enabling the business by, hey, we're not going to do security and I'm going to get out of the way, but how do you enable security in such a way that it also enables the business? So one of my favorite examples is, so in the cloud, right, one of the bedrocks is IAM. And IAM kind of becomes the edge of the cloud. Well, I'm going to go harden IAM, where I'm going to make an IAM perimeter. That's a weird sell to a board of directors, right? Where they're like, what does IAM mean, right? You're really not speaking business language. In fact, you're speaking deep technical language. And so one of the examples I like to use is, how would you sell cloud IAM in a meaningful way up the chain? And so here, I actually have an example I'm going to read to you that I've often used to help kind of formulate an answer to that question, right? I'm going to help enable secure connections and accelerate provisioning of new users' environments by automating visibility and measuring against best practices to continuously drive down risk. So that's a pitch that I could hopefully make to a CIO, and a CIO is going to be enable secure connections, quickly provision new users and environments. Yeah, that's the innovation. That's the kind of enablement I want as a CIO. But also your board of directors can go, wait, so it's going to be faster, you're going to be more secure, and you're going to drive down risk. Yeah, those all sound like business initiatives that I want, right? And so then you can begin to even measure that. How quickly can you onboard people? How consistently can you put them into the correct role? How are you ensuring on the back end with measurement tools that those roles aren't over provisioned or aren't being over provisioned? So sometimes in the tech world, in the cloud, we call those guardrails, but really boiling those up to something more meaningful at the business level is key.
Thank you. Can I push that thinking a little bit?
Sure.
Okay. So now you've articulated a few business objectives. You've translated the technical language into a few business objectives. And somebody on the receiving end is going to receive them and say, okay, this sounds sensible. We should do this. How do I weigh this against other similar business objectives? How do you drive a win in that conversation?
That's a good question too. So I often try to sell my business objectives with the business, not in an isolated container, right? So a great example is when I was working as a CISO in a bank, we were looking at a pain point. Our pain point was our online banking system was purchased through our core banking app, and it was kind of a bolt-on system. It was old. It was really old, right? Like, at least from IT perspective, it was over a decade old. So it was really old. And so from a security standpoint, I didn't feel good about it. And so the typical response would be, hey, let's go scan that, let's pen test it, and let's just bombard these guys with these findings to make them fix it. And I did understand my risk. I assessed that. But instead of presenting it to all the upper management first, I went to my innovators, the people in the company that could actually build, right? And I said, hey, innovator, here's the problem. What do you think we should do about this? And we came up with SDLC, back before pipelines were a thing, and where we actually automated and created our own scripts to test things and move them to production. But we also said, hey, we should practice doing this, but let's go for a big idea. There's so much work here to fix this. I think we could build it from scratch for cheaper. And I said, well, that makes an interesting co-pitch, right? And so we co-pitched this idea to management, and actually rewrote an online banking app that's pretty widely used now in the credit union industry. And so thinking big, innovative, working with key stakeholders, and really aligning yourself with the business, I had a huge amount of wins from a security standpoint, but also from a business enablement standpoint. And that's why I think we have to be careful with our messaging. Is the point isn't to enable the business by driving down your security bar. The point is to work with the innovators and build towards a security model that's going to help both security and the business, or the
Thank you.
business through security.
Perfect. Yeah, thank you. And congratulations on building a fundamental piece of technology that is widely used, right? That's always a beautiful thing to be a part of.
Yeah.
Now, I have a question on, over time, you spent decades in the industry, right? So now, if you were to wind back, let's say 2 decades, and come back to now, suddenly you would feel that cloud technology, SaaS products, these are ubiquitous. Everyone is using them. And you, as a security leader, have the challenge of managing risk in this context, right? And to compound this problem, everyone is adopting or has already adopted a hybrid work model, work from home and come to the office, right? How do you view security in this context?
Yeah, so I feel like this is a context that has been shifting for a long time. And I think we fought it as security people, and maybe sometimes that's our mistake. Sometimes we fight security tech or new technologies instead of building paradigms to secure it. So a great example is, some of the panic around the new language models, right? There's obviously security risk there. It's obviously not going away. We're going to have to figure out to secure it. So rather than fighting it, we need to get in early as security practitioners and figure out how to put the right security, even if that's branching to a broader security perspective that includes compliance and privacy and some of those other risks, not just pure security, right? So, in the early days, I started as a network engineer in the .com days, getting people online. And literally the first call I got after I brought a few hundred customers online and built out their Cisco infrastructure was, hey, our servers are getting hacked. And I went, wait, what? They're like, yeah, bad people are taking over our servers. And I called Cisco and said, what are we going to do? They said, well, we have this brand new product, a firewall, right? And so we started down this road that we, for a long time, kind of got called the shell, right? The hard outside shell and the GUI center. And it didn't take us very long to figure out that didn't work either, right? And so we've continued to, as new technologies come in, continue to mold and morph that design. I feel like we've had 1,000 buzzwords that all mean the same thing, that in many ways kind of ended up in what we call a zero trust model today. But we've been figuring out, well, bring your own advice. Okay, we got to do an MDM. We've got to figure out how to secure these users. And really, conceptually, it comes down to the same principles every time: authentication and how you authenticate your users, how you validate and authenticate their device, and how you provision permissions to them. And usually some other third component about that's based on their risk, maybe their location, right? If they're internal, they're external, and then the last piece is, what are they accessing? Are they taking high value stuff internally? Are they going out to a cloud or a SaaS model? Are they doing? But those basic principles, from the first day that someone dropped a bunch of iPhones in my environment and said, get these online, to now, doesn't feel or look that much different to me, where you have this huge distributed model. It's really about, hey, do you understand how to validate your users, your devices, where they're going, what they're accessing, and how you provision that. And so, I've kind of been through enough cycles of the industry. It all starts to look and feel the same, maybe some different buzzwords put around it each time. But some of those key principles that we've always talked about, that never seem to expire, right? Defense in depth, least privilege. If I can touch it, I can own it. So let's make assumptions based on that. Some of those basic principles continue to flow through no matter how many times we iterate the technology.
Across these hype cycles, one emerging buzzword that has stayed for some time is zero trust, and I'm glad you mentioned it earlier. Can you share with us, because you've been around long enough where you can see it becoming a thing, from nothing to becoming a thing, right? What were its roots? How did it evolve? Can you share more? And how do you see adoption today of zero trust as well?
Yeah. So I think zero trust probably goes back, kind of the first elements of zero trust that we saw adopt is, we first said, okay, we want to bring your own device. What do we do with this device? How do we control it? How do we authenticate it? How do we wipe it? At that point, we started talking about things like encryption. We started talking about things about like MFA. So we kind of had this first, if we could just figure out what the user and device is, we're going to be okay, right? And then as zero trust morphed, we said, well, we got to push that not just external and internal. Now we've got to get a little bit more defined on internal. We started talking about segmentation and then micro segmentation, and how do we break up the network. At the same time, there's a lot of discussions about pivoting across network and phishing, and how do you make sure that if an end station is compromised, you can't move across the entire thing, or you don't have a flat network, was another buzzword, right? At that same time, we had a lot of new ideas introduced, like zero trust, zero day, that, hey, there are things that are going to get in that you can't patch for. Like patching can't be your solution for everything, right? And so that kind of helped continue to drive this paradigm. And that really took place on what I would call, on the corporate level, your endpoint LAN or your user LANs, right? Your segment of your network that had devices and users on them. But then we kind of saw a shift in models where we said, okay, that's probably not enough, right? We probably need to protect our data center. Like your data center can't just be a flat network. And really started talking about zoning and software defined networking, and how do you authenticate to zones and users and devices all the way to applications. And we started seeing application intelligence shift into our firewalls and some of our devices. And that started to mature. And as we do in security, we raise the bar, and then it gets painful and we shift to another area, right? So then we shifted back to the users, and we said, okay, they're getting compromised. And we said, we need sandboxes, and we need smarter endpoints than antivirus. And so we built that up, and that quickly started to morph into things that we called NAC and NAP back in the days, right? Where now you're interrogating that device. So you're adding another level. This was kind of the days of the proliferation of agents, right? Where we started seeing more and more agents on endpoints. So you kind of have this growing steam. As that shifted, we also started we saw this internal segmentation, this device heavy agents. We started putting more and more on the edge to try to stop those phishing attacks. So we got these heavy edges where we were doing web filtering and we were doing emails and spam protections. And we were doing all this stuff at the edge. We got this big edge. We've got this very segmented. Then we kind of shifted back to the data centers and said, okay, how do we make this all play together? And if you kind of take all those ideas and you mash them together, you actually have most of the basis of a zero trust infrastructure. So it's a new buzzword that I think does a good job of accumulating a lot of ideas from the past, but I'm not sure it's a great new innovative idea. What I do like about zero trust is when we get past using it as a marketing language and we start to see people like CISA build some controls and some frameworks around it, that we can start agreeing across the industry to align and measure ourselves. So as an industry, we can say, hey, this is really where I measure up, and here's where I can improve, and here's where I might have gaps.
Thank you for sharing this. Very interesting. How do you see the adoption of it? Are a lot of companies using zero trust, or is it mainly a marketing discussion?
Well, I think zero trust was mostly a marketing buzzword until CISA started to put out some guidance defining what zero trust is. So now that we actually have measurable, actionable guidance, which kind of takes us all the way back to our business objective discussion, right? Now we have something that we can measure against. I don't know if zero trust necessarily excites our board and our CIO, right? We probably have messaging to do outside of the security industry on that. But from a model that we can measure and get metrics from, we've got that first key piece that moves us away from marketing and buzzwords to something that's implementable. And zero trust, another favorite term that was thrown out for a long time was APTs. And now we've got a lot of threat intelligence and profiling of actors. But all of that really is just intelligence that's coming out of this infrastructure, right? And saying, okay, based on this infrastructure, now I can glean this data that can help me begin to identify how is someone moving through the network, what are their techniques, what might they be related to, what might be their intents, right? Where we've kind of shifted to a level of threat intelligence where we're not just saying bad actor, we're trying to understand their intents so that we know what that core data is that we're trying to protect, which takes us back to some of that data center modeling where you're trying to figure out how to protect your crown jewels or your core IP assets and understand where they are and put them in some kind of enclaves or special protections.
You mentioned APTs, and that rings a bell in my mind. I was speaking to a senior government official about 2 or 3 weeks ago, and he says that he views the industry in this way. He broke it down into numbers. He said there is 90% of people who are your average criminal types who go online, they read a script, and they try their luck. They download it and they try to deploy it, right? And one of the emerging threats there is ransomware as a service, which is making it a lot easier and putting business model around it and so on, right? He says 90% of the threat actor population is like that, your average guys, right? It's like the criminal who walks down the road and sees that your house isn't locked and decides to let's try something, right?
Mm-hmm.
Then there is that 9%, which is skilled, talented, organized, capable. That's the realm of APTs, advanced persistent threat actors, right? So this would be nation states. They're well organized, they're very well resourced, and if they decide to go after you, there are some things you can do to slow them down, maybe sometimes deter them. But if they're very determined and they stick around long enough, they're going to get into your systems, and things can happen. And he also further went on to say, now there's 99, and he says that there's 1% of the population where if they decide to get you, this is the stuff of movies, whatever you do, you can't stop them. Do you agree with this thinking? Do you see that happening in your career so far?
Yeah, so I think that has shifted over time, right? I've definitely seen, in the early days of the script kiddies to the early DOS attacks where people first were commercializing attacks, right? Before we had ransomware, there was DOS attacks and we're going to keep on DOSing you and you're going to lose X amount of money. That's now morphed into ransomware. And of course, ransomware is not even its own thing anymore, right? There's ransomware, I'm going to encrypt your stuff, but there's really ransomware that is, I've already kidnapped your data and do you want it back, right? Or I'm going to release it publicly. And now we're hearing people getting charged 2 or 3 times through all those, right? So even ransomware has continued to mature and figure out new ways to commoditize. As far as the actors, I think we've always had nation state actors and probably been a little naive. I could definitely trace attacks 15 years ago back to a couple nation states, or what we called the Russian mafia at that time, right? That was doing a lot of the financial attacks when we were in finance. So I think we've done a better job of profiling some of that. Where I want to talk about that 1%, though, I always have a native problem with there's just people we can't beat or adversaries we can't tackle. My perspective is it's a cat and mouse game, and we always eventually catch up, and then they're forced to innovate. Every time we catch up and force them to innovate, though, we add more cost and complexity to their side, right? So there's a weighing game there. I believe AIML truly has the opportunity to shift the tables, because if you look at the sophistication of the attacks, where you're trying to have to do a supply chain attack, where you're attacking someone basically external to their environment in hopes they'll suck that in, right, via their supply chain, or where we look at an attack living off the land, where they're actually using your own tool sets against you. Those attacks in complexity get extremely difficult to detect with humans. However, if we actually could, in a cheap and affordable way, ingest the data, but a lot of times we already have the tools to collect, but we can't afford to ingest it or analyze it. And we could analyze that in meaningful ways and build baselines, and we could automate the stupid stuff we do. My SOC was still fighting Conflicker, right? You know, we spend a lot of time chasing down stupid stuff still in security that we've got to figure out how to automate so that we can go after those more intelligent threat actors. And we've got to get those data and insights past the human level where they are machine intelligent, and they can flag for us the high likely probability stuff that we can investigate. But until we stop a little bit of the firefighting mode we've been stuck in for the last decade, that paradigm is going to be true. But I kind of refuse to believe that paradigm will always be true or always has to be true.
So is that 1% that ignites your thinking and actually brings out the best in you, right? You're thinking we don't want to always catch up. We want to get ahead at some point and make things change. And AI/ML, like you mentioned, represents a tremendous opportunity for such a paradigm shift. Equally, on the threat actor side, it also presents similar opportunities too, right?
Sure.
So it is always going to be a cat and mouse game. How is it possible for, depending on how you view yourself, the cat or the mouse, right? How do you get to a stage where you're a few steps ahead? It starts with design, in my opinion, right? How do you design your systems in the first place, such that there's a lot of organizations now they are saying we operate from an assume breach mindset. That means we already assume that you're in our systems, right? And then they start from there. But there are equally a big segment of the population that is saying, you know what, let's fortify our fortress. Let's make sure that nobody can get in. But I think that kind of thinking is going to get outdated more and more, because it's difficult to keep people out all the time, always. And you know, the job that security professionals have is to do it always, which is very tiring. That fatigue sets in, and once your guard gets let down or you miss something or the other, and that's where your entry points, you know, get breached, and things happen from there. But let's come back to AI/ML. We talk a lot about large language models. OpenAI has been trending very much in the industry, but I guess the AI/ML that you're referring to is different from large language models, or does it include large language models for us to apply in security context?
The language models are more interesting to me in kind of DevOps cycles, and looking at, are there ways we can improve some of our tools and our intelligence to speed development along in a secure way. So that's where right now I'm seeing the biggest wins for language models. language models also have the ability to dip into some of that automation that I was talking about on the SOC, SIM, SOAR, XDR, whatever we want to call it today with the cool marketing term. We're still not winning there, right? We're still not winning that battle. We've got to figure out how to get ahead of that curve, and we're going to have to figure out how to automate more intelligently and have a higher standard for what we call automation, or what our vendors call automation, and have an expectation that we need to catch all those actors. And I always go back to some security thinking that I think is a little broken, and I'll pick on that 99.1% example a little bit. But it's, well, if I'm wrong once, they're in, and I have to be right all the time, and they can be wrong over and over until they get in. And there is some truth to that part of the cat and mouse game, but there's also a flaw there. And that's where I really like to say, okay, let's go back to our defense and depth principles, right? And take you back a couple decades and talk about why this principle keeps on lasting. If I build 6 walls, right, and I'm building this all along the way, data, network, endpoint, edge, all the pieces, right? And I'm putting these walls in. I don't need those walls to be 100% effective. In fact, you're probably wasting security budget if you're trying to make those walls 100% effective. If I have 6 walls and they're all 80% effective, that second wall is 80% effective to that last 20%. And so you have an iterative math that we kind of ignore sometimes. And the reality is, each one of those choke points should give you an opportunity to detect an attacker and make it harder and harder, right? And again, it's an economics game. You've got to drive their cost up. And that means discovering them not when they're exfiltrating your environment and your data, right? That means discovering them in those early processes of them trying to navigate around your walls. That's also a reason why I'm a huge opponent, pro honeypots. I think you can catch those 1% with the right honeypots, right? Because they're still blind, fumbling around in the dark, trying to do discovery on you, right? I've been on the other side. I hack on the other side and play with it. You're poking around, you're feeling around, you're trying not to set off alarm bells, but you're doing discovery and you're fumbling around in the dark. And if there's something that sounds like an attractive target, you're going to poke at it, right? That's what happens. And so we've got to get into a little bit more entrapment defense, right? Where we take a little bit more offensive stance to our defense. And I mean, that goes back to some of the original kind of art of war thinking that we've talked about in log management for a long time, right? But we've really got to get back to some of those principles, and we can't get in a loser mindset just because we've lost some big notable battles, right? We've got to remember some of these principles have held true, and why they're holding true, and why we need to continue to build that way to get in front of some of these threats.
Absolutely, Chad. Never get in that mindset. Digitization is going to continue. Society will be at risk if we accept defeat. So we have to keep trying, And a lot of these are amazing intellectual challenges too. The next thing that's going to come our way is quantum computing. That's gonna make locks become almost ineffective. So there has to be measures, and there are already measures in place where people are trying to develop security solutions to when quantum computing becomes the norm, right? So I think this will continue. But what I'm really drawn to is the fact that you say always go back to first principles and work from there, because things evolve from there. First principles, they are perpetual, and they are effective. So we should keep this in mind when designing solutions, when deploying solutions, and thinking about remediations as well. So thanks for sharing this. For security measures, there are 2 things here. This is getting a little bit more technical than usual, but I'd love to just go a bit deeper with you. The 2 parts here which are known to augment security measures, right? One is multi-party computation, another one is homomorphic encryption. Do you have views on how effective these are in augmenting security measures? These are emerging technologies. Do you have thoughts around these?
I think, like all emerging technologies, they're still in the learning phases. I think they're the right direction, right? We've seen a lot of the polymorphic attacks work pretty effectively against us from the other side, right? So some of the polymorphic encryption, I think these are all ways that we need to be working into the future. I don't know that I see those as high impacting in today's world. I see those as kind of our security R&D investment for the future for the threats we see on the horizon.
Got it. Thank you for sharing. In your work, do you have to deal with ethical dilemmas? We're talking a lot about AI ML and the resulting ethical issues that we'll have to navigate. Countries are pushing out. For example, Singapore has pushed out AI governance framework / model that folks can use when designing AI ML solutions. In your work, do key ethical dilemmas arise, and how do you navigate them?
I think the primary ethical dilemma that I've wrestled with throughout my career is how we manage privacy, right? And I think that plays into this same model. I think privacy is sometimes an overlooked portion. Security modeling, especially in the US, I know that Europe has taken a little bit of a lead on that. But really, a temptation as a security person is collect all the data you can get, right? And we'll figure it out on the back end and stuff. But really analyzing what are my use cases? Why am I collecting this? Who should have access to it? When should they have access? How is that access tracked? Those same questions play into every data lake and AIML model, right? Because ultimately every AIML model is trained on data, right? And so as a security person, I am always going back, where's the data? And so to me, it's all about how you're modeling out and really thinking through what are my use cases? What are the right people that could see this? I'm a security person. How could this be abused? How do we protect that? Right. I think a lot of our social media platforms have run across those pain points as they've tried to navigate that. And I think we have to prioritize privacy in our security and risk modeling. I think that's going to be the key perspective that we need to start looking through in order to help us navigate some of these dilemmas for any kind of responsible compute really in the future. And so I guess that would be my answer is we need to really start building out and thinking through how we address privacy as IT practitioners, not just security.
Thank you for sharing this. Additionally, we had a good discussion around cybersecurity, the 9% and 1%. And however, you also mentioned that a lot of our time gets stuck chasing after things, and compliance is one big area, right? Can you share more about how you navigate the complexities of regulatory frameworks? This is your standard, SOC 2, ISO, NIST, and so on.
So every compliance framework and every control framework has native strengths and weaknesses. And if you tie yourself to forcing everything to fit in that box, your compliance is actually going to hurt your security, or your compliance is going to become checkmark compliance, which actually weakens your security. So I always believe compliance should be viewed through a security lens. Compliance is what I consider the low bar, right? And security is the high bar. Controls tend to fall in there somewhere, right? It's a great way to define and measure yourself. And so I think that's important. But I think you have to intelligently look at those. And so I think when it comes to compliance, whether you're looking at a control framework or an external compliance, that failing a control, I don't think is the ultimate evil we make it. I think you should be willing to choose to fail a control and put in mitigating controls that make the most sense for your business and for security. And you need to document those and be able to communicate those and get buy off on those. But take the time to do the real work and write up why you're going to choose to fail a control and how you're going to actually improve your security posture by doing the right thing. To me, that is the ultimate. And I actually had a whole podcast 10, 12 years ago on this, but that is really the key of compliance, right? I built an IT audit program, a compliance program, a governance program, and a security program for a financial institution. They brought me in and said, help us figure out Graham-Leach-Bliley, right? And I worked with the FFIEC and worked with our auditors and built that out. And so that was always I had a huge benefit of having all those interconnected pieces. And I think we shoot ourselves in the foot sometimes in the industry by disconnecting those pieces. We're doing something for compliance. If it doesn't drive value, we need to challenge that. And I think audit and compliance should be held to the same business outcomes that I'm saying that we should hold security to. Whereas, how is following this control adding value? If I don't meet this PCI control, and I actually helped when PCI came out, I was 1.0 I was part of. I actually helped refine the rules for 1.1 and 1.2 for PCI. And what I found is the worst thing you could do is just accept a framework, right? Visa was so open to, hey, I have concerns. Here's why this makes more sense. Here's how we could do this better. And a lot of that is now reflected in the PCI standard, right? We need to, as technicians who have some of the deeper insight, do a better job of working with, educating, and driving business value through compliance and audit and controls versus just checking boxes. So sorry, you triggered me on one of my soapbox subjects there, but
Chad, this is talking to you. I get a sense that I am talking to one of the security pioneers and legends in the industry. AWS is lucky to have you, and we are lucky to have you on our show. It is good to be able to probe your mind and understand the history, the evolution, what the realities of current situations are, and how we can progress from there, right? Now, I just want to come back to this point here where you mentioned that controls, we have to challenge some of these. We should be okay to fail some of them as long as we are clear what we're going to mitigate them with and so on, right? For an enterprise, it is possible that their internal controls can go into the hundreds, right? So how do you do that? How do you apply that mindset into these hundreds of controls? You will need a big team to be able to do this and have meaningful discussion around it. Any thoughts around this? And this would be my final question for this one. I can keep going on and asking you more. I would love to have you on a...
I'm going to pitch my reinforce talk, which was about how to automate compliance at scale. And what we need to do is get out of some of the rigidity of the way we feel like we have to manually validate controls and some of that audit mindset, and figure out how can we move the heavy lifting of control auditing to automation. And I think we sometimes feel like, well, if I put enough blood and sweat and tears into it, it's valuable. But we really, where we want your blood, sweat, and tears as auditors, as compliance people, as security people, is not going to the ERP system and beating somebody up over adding one extra access to their user role. I need those people in the industry to focus that detail and that thinking to AIML models, to emerging technologies, to the spaces where we are trying to catch up versus trying to look for that big finding on your next audit write-up, right? In the system that you've audited 700 times. I used to do quarterly pen testing at the bank, and I did horrible things to my poor IT people, like ship boxes with activated Wi-Fi's they got internally, and and launch denial of service attacks to distract them from a phishing attack we logged. We did all these cool things, or seed the parking lot with USB drives. I mean, we did all these clever things, but my team finally said to me at one point, and I had an amazing hacking team, they said, hey, Chad, we need to actually stop. And I'm like, what are you talking about? I give you money. They're like, you're not driving value in the business at this point. You've prodded these guys from every angle. You probably need to do something like look at your physical security. And we found so many physical security problems that, as far as value to the business and protecting my business long term, added 100-fold value to running another pen test and pounding, brute forcing this and poking this or sending users emails, right? And so I really challenge us, get out of your paradigms and boxes, automate that stuff, and do something new and innovative. Find those risk areas, look around corners, tackle emerging technologies. And the only way you're going to enable doing that is letting go of some of that blood, sweat, and tear control of the minutia and automating it whether that be in your SOC or in your audit program, so that you can tackle the real risks that are really going to help our business and help our security community as a whole make an impact.
Thank you so much, Chad. Your final response is actually a great parting message for our audience as well. So with that, it is sad that we have come to the end of this show because we have a time limit to adhere to. But it was great speaking with you. Thank you so much for your time.
It's great speaking. Thank you for having me on. I appreciate it.